11 years. That is how long my wife and I had paid our homeowner's insurance. On time, every single month, through 2 job changes and 1 recession, and a stretch where we ate a lot of beans so the auto draft would clear. 11 years of premiums to a company with a friendly name and a commercial where a nice man in a sweater promises to be there when life knocks you down. And when life finally knocked us down, when half our house went up in a kitchen fire on an ordinary Tuesday night, that company answered us with exactly one word. Denied. My name is Mark, and I want to tell you this story the way it actually happened. Slow and infuriating, and in the end, deeply satisfying. Because I think a lot of you have either been here or are terrified you will be. This is not a story about a fire. The fire was the easy part, if you can believe that. This is a story about what an insurance company will do when it decides that a tired working family will be too beaten down to fight. And about what happens when that family turns out to have kept every receipt. Let me set the table first. My wife's name is Teresa. We had been married 19 years when the fire happened, and we lived in a modest 3-bedroom on a street of modest 3-bedrooms in a working town where the biggest employer is a distribution warehouse and the second biggest is the hospital. I do maintenance for the school district, boilers and rooftop units and whatever leaks. And Teresa works in the cafeteria at the middle school, which means we both smell faintly of industrial cleaner at the end of the day, and we both know the value of $1 because we have counted every one of ours. We had one kid still at home, our daughter Grace, 16 at the time. A good kid, sarcastic in the way 16-year-olds are, glued to her phone, but underneath it, soft-hearted. And we had a dog, an old beagle named Biscuit, who Grace had picked out at the shelter when she was 6. Gray around the muzzle now, and mostly interested in sleeping in the one spot of afternoon sun on the living room floor. That house was not much to anybody driving past. To us, it was the whole world. Every door frame had pencil marks tracking Grace's height. That matters later, so hold on to it. Teresa baked. I need you to know this because it becomes the villain of the story in a way you will not see coming. She was not a professional. She had a full-time job in a cafeteria. But on weekends, she baked. Cakes and pies and these cinnamon rolls that could make a grown man weep. And she gave most of it away, to church, to the neighbors, to the teachers at Grace's school. Sometimes, if a coworker asked, she would make a birthday cake and let them slip her $40 for the ingredients and her Saturday. And she always felt a little guilty taking it. That is the extent of Teresa's criminal empire. Remember that word, $40. It is going to come back. The fire started the way these things do, which is to say, from nothing, from an ordinary evening. It was a Tuesday in October. Teresa had a sheet pan in the oven and had stepped out to switch the laundry. And something in the old wiring behind the range, wiring that was in that house long before we ever bought it, arced and caught. By the time the smoke alarm went off, and thank God we had good smoke alarms, the wall behind the stove was already going. I grabbed the extinguisher from under the sink, but it was past the point an extinguisher does anything, and I did the only smart thing I did that whole night, which was to yell for Teresa and Grace to get out, get Biscuit, get out, now. We stood in the front yard in our socks and watched the kitchen glow orange through the window, and Teresa was on the phone with the fire department, saying our address twice because her voice was shaking, saying 911 had connected her, and now she could not remember the house number she had known for 11 years. Grace was crying and holding Biscuit, who was trembling against her chest. The trucks came fast, our town is small, and the station is close. And the firefighters were good, and they saved most of the house. But most is not all. The kitchen was gone. The dining room was gone. Smoke and water took the living room, the pencil marks on the doorframe, the couch, the rug where an old beagle liked to sleep in the sun. I keep coming back to the small things from that night, the ones that do not fit in a claim form. Grace in her pajama pants and one shoe because she had grabbed a single shoe on the way out and nobody thought to say anything. A neighbor I had waved at for years but never really talked to, standing beside me in his robe, not saying a word, just being there, which is its own language on a street like ours. The way Biscuit would not stop shaking until Grace sat down on the curb and held him in her lap and pressed her face into his fur. Two frightened creatures comforting each other while the grown-ups dealt with the fire. You do not think, in that moment, about premiums and provisions. You think about the fact that the people you love are standing in the cold instead of inside the orange. The firefighters let me back in for 2 minutes near dawn, once it was cold and safe, to grab what I could. I want to tell you I made smart choices. I did not. I stood in the ruined living room with water dripping through the ceiling, and my mind went completely blank. And I grabbed the strangest things, a shoebox of photographs that turned out to be mostly ruined anyway, Grace's science project off the dining table, a coffee mug that meant nothing to anyone. The one genuinely smart thing I grabbed, without even knowing why at the time, was the plastic bin from the hall closet where Teresa kept every important paper we owned: the mortgage, the policy, the tax returns. Water had gotten the corner of it, but the papers inside were dry. That bin is the only reason parts of this story ended the way they did. Nobody was hurt. I held on to that all night, standing in a neighbor's driveway, wrapped in a blanket somebody brought out, watching steam rise off my own roof. Nobody was hurt. We had insurance. We had paid it for 11 years, faithfully. And this, I told Teresa, her face gray in the streetlight, this is exactly what it is for. This is the bad night the nice man in the sweater promised to show up for. We are going to be okay. I believed that completely. I want you to understand that I believed it. Because the story is about how that belief got taken apart, piece by piece, by the very people who sold it to me. The first few days, honestly, the company was fine. That is part of the trick, I think now. We called the claim in the next morning, and a friendly voice took the report, and within a couple of days, a field adjuster came out, a guy named Doug with a clipboard and a firm handshake. And Doug walked the wreckage with us and made sympathetic noises and told us not to worry, that they would take care of us, that we should keep our receipts for a hotel and meals, because our policy covered additional living expenses while the house was uninhabitable. He said the words additional living expenses like they were a warm blanket, and we wrapped ourselves in them. So we did what Doug said. We moved into a motel by the highway for 2 weeks, the three of us and Biscuit in one room that smelled like cigarettes and pine cleaner, Grace doing homework on a bedspread while a truck idled outside the window. Then, because 2 weeks in a motel with a teenager and a beagle is its own kind of house fire, we found a small rental across town, month to month, and we put the deposit and the first month on a credit card, because Doug had said additional living expenses were covered, and we assumed the reimbursement was coming any day. We kept every receipt in a shoebox like he told us. We were good, cooperative, trusting policyholders. We were exactly what they wanted. I want you to sit in that motel room with us for a second, because that limbo is where they do their real damage, in the waiting. Displacement is expensive in 100 small ways nobody plans for. You have no kitchen, so every meal is bought, and fast food for 3 people, 3 times a day, adds up faster than you would believe. Grace needed clothes because most of hers smelled like smoke, and the rest were ash. We needed a second set of everything, because our everything was in a house we could not enter. Teresa kept a running total in a little notebook, and I watched her get quieter each night as the number climbed, both of us telling each other, it was fine, it was covered, the reimbursement was coming. The rental helped and hurt at the same time. It was a decent little place, and having a door that locked and a stove that worked made us feel human again. But that credit card balance was now a real thing with a real interest rate, growing every month we floated the housing that our policy was supposed to be paying for. I did the math one night after Grace was asleep and realized that if this dragged on much longer, we would be paying interest on the privilege of being displaced from a house we still owed a mortgage on. A mortgage we were, of course, still paying because the bank does not care that your kitchen is a hole in the wall. 2 housing payments, 1 income squeezed, and a company telling us the claim was under review. That word, review, became a kind of psychological warfare, though I did not have the language for it then. Every call ended with under review, and under review has no clock on it, no deadline, no promise. It is a door that is neither open nor closed, and you cannot plan a life around a door like that. Do we enroll Grace's address change at school as permanent or temporary? Do we sign another month on the rental or not? Do we start pulling contractor quotes to rebuild, or is that jumping the gun? Every decision hung on an answer they would not give. And I understand now that the not giving was the strategy. A family frozen in review is a family too anxious and too tired to fight. Then Doug stopped calling back. That was the first cold draft. Calls that used to be returned same day started taking 3 days, then a week. The friendly voice on the claims line became a series of different voices, each one with no memory of the last, each one telling us the claim was under review. Under review. We heard that phrase so many times it stopped sounding like English. Weeks went by. The credit card balance for the rental grew. The adjuster who had walked our ashes with such sympathy had gone quiet. And in the silence, I started, for the first time, to feel something other than gratitude toward the company in the commercial. I started to feel watched. The denial came by mail, 6 weeks after the fire, in a plain envelope. I remember Teresa handed it to me at the little kitchen table in the rental, because she saw the return address and could not open it herself. It was 3 pages of dense paragraphs, and I read it twice before I understood what it was saying, because the language was built to be hard to understand. And when I finally translated it into human, I had to sit down. They were denying the claim. The entire claim. All of it. And the reason they had decided not to pay for 11 years of a family's faith was Teresa's cinnamon rolls. I am not exaggerating for effect. The denial letter invoked a provision of our policy about concealment and material misrepresentation. And it stated that our homeowner's policy did not cover a property being used for business or commercial purposes, and that we had failed to disclose that the insured premises were being used as a commercial bakery, and that this undisclosed business use constituted a material misrepresentation that voided coverage. Somewhere in their review, some analyst looking for a reason, any reason, had found that Teresa occasionally accepted $40 for a birthday cake, and had decided to call our home a commercial bakery, and had used those weekend cinnamon rolls to erase 11 years of premiums and deny a family a place to live. Teresa did not get angry. That is the part that still hurts me. She got quiet, and then she got ashamed, and she said in a small voice that this was her fault, that if she had never taken that money for the cakes, none of this would have happened. And she started crying at the little rental table and apologizing to me and Grace like she had burned the house down herself. And that, right there, was the moment the whole thing changed for me, because I realized what they had done. They had not just denied a claim. They had taken a woman who bakes for her church and made her feel like a criminal for it, to save themselves the cost of a kitchen. And they were counting on that shame. They were counting on Teresa being too tired and too embarrassed to fight, and on me being too busy keeping the lights on. and on us just quietly going away. I read that denial letter a third time that night, after Teresa had gone to bed, sitting alone at the rental table with the lamp on. And somewhere in the third reading, underneath the anger, something clicked into place and got very cold and very clear. They had made a choice. Somewhere in a building I would never see, a person with a job and a coffee mug had looked at a family that had paid faithfully for 11 years, had a legitimate fire, and needed help, and had decided the smarter business move was to find a technicality and make us disappear. That was not a mistake. It was a decision. And a decision made by people can be unmade by people if you refuse to be the easy answer they planned on. I have a temper, and I want to be honest that my first instinct was to call them up and scream. And I did. And it accomplished exactly nothing. Which is the second thing I want you to learn from this. Screaming at the claims line is what they are built to absorb. The person answering is trained to be sorry and unable to help, and every minute you spend furious on the phone is a minute you are not doing the thing that actually scares them. So after I burned that anger off uselessly for a couple of days, I did something different. I got cold. I got organized. I decided that if they wanted to turn this into a paper fight, I was going to bury them in paper. Because a maintenance man who keeps a boiler running for 20 years knows a thing or two about documentation. Here is what I did not know at the start, and what I want every person listening to write down, because it changed everything. I did not know that a homeowner does not have to face an insurance company alone, with nothing but a shoebox of receipts. I found this out from my brother-in-law, who does construction, and who, when I told him what happened, got a hard look on his face and said one phrase I had never heard. He said, "You need a public adjuster." And then he said the second thing that saved us, which was, "And you file a complaint with the state insurance commissioner." Because what they just did has a name, and the name is bad faith. A public adjuster, I learned, is a licensed professional who works for the policyholder, not the insurance company. The adjuster who had walked our ashes, Doug, worked for them. A public adjuster works for you and knows the policy language and the claims process as well as the company does, and takes a percentage of the settlement instead of a fee up front, which meant I could afford one precisely because I had no money, since they only got paid if we got paid. I found a well-reviewed one 2 counties over, a woman named Sandra, who had done this for 20 years, and had, I could tell in the first 10 minutes, absolutely no fear of these companies whatsoever. She read our denial letter, and she did something I will never forget. She laughed. She laughed, and then she apologized for laughing, and then she explained why. The commercial bakery argument, she said, was one of the flimsiest denials she had seen in years. A stretch so thin, it told her the company had gone looking for any excuse, rather than pay a valid claim. Occasional baking that a homeowner does not run as a real business, no storefront, no employees, no commercial equipment, no real revenue, does not transform a family home into a commercial enterprise. And a woman accepting $40 now and then for ingredients and her Saturday is not operating a bakery any more than a kid with a lemonade stand is running a beverage corporation. This denial, Sandra said, was not a legal position. It was a bet. They were betting we would fold. Sandra sat at our little rental table that first afternoon and taught us how the game was actually played. And it was like someone finally turning the lights on in a room I had been stumbling around in for weeks. She told us the companies rely on a simple truth, which is that most people have never read their own policy, do not know the words good faith have a legal meaning, and assume that a denial letter on official paper is the end of the road. Most people, she said, get a letter like ours, and they cry, and then they quietly walk away and eat the loss. and the company keeps the money. And that quiet walking away is not an accident. It is the business model. The valid claims they successfully talk families out of paying are pure profit. And then she told us the thing that made me sit up straight, the thing I had never once considered. She said the denial letter, the one that had made Teresa cry and feel like a criminal, was in a strange way a gift, because it was in writing. A verbal runaround leaves you nothing. But they had put their reason on paper, a specific, checkable, provable reason. And the reason was garbage. And a garbage reason in writing is not a wall, it is a target. She held up our own denial letter like it was evidence, which it was about to become. And she said, "They think this is the thing that ends it. We're going to make it the thing that ends it for them." I had spent 6 weeks feeling like prey. That was the first afternoon I started to feel like something else. So we unbet them. Sandra ran the claim the way it should have been run from the start, and watching her work was like watching a professional walk into a job the amateurs had botched. She documented the loss properly, room by room, the structure and the contents, with photographs and a detailed inventory and repair estimates from real contractors. And she put a real number on what the company owed, a number far larger than the vague figures Doug had waved at us. She reconstructed everything, down to the pencil marks on the doorframe, which you cannot replace, but which a proper contents inventory does not ignore. For the first time since the fire, I felt like somebody was on our side, who knew the rules of the game. Doing that inventory was one of the hardest and strangest things I have ever done, and I think anyone who has been through it will understand. You do not realize how much a life weighs until you have to list it. We sat with Sandra and went room by room from memory and from photos, naming every single thing that had been in a house we could no longer walk through. The good pots Teresa had saved up for, Grace's baby book, the winter coats, the tools in the garage I had collected one paycheck at a time over 20 years. You say each thing out loud, and a stranger writes it on a list. And every item is a small grief, and at the same time, a line on a document that would eventually force a company to make it right. Grief and evidence, the same list. That was the whole texture of those weeks. Sandra was patient with the parts that were not really about money, and I respected her for it. When Teresa's voice caught on the box of Grace's kindergarten drawings, Sandra did not rush her, but she also gently reminded us that the goal was to be complete, because every honest thing left off the list was a thing the company got to keep for free. So we were complete. It felt almost clinical, and it needed to be, because the version of us that had stood crying in the front yard was not going to win this. The version that sat down and calmly wrote out the full and honest weight of everything we had lost, that version was going to win, because it spoke the only language the company actually respected, which was documentation. And then we built the record for the commissioner, which was the part that had teeth. This is the piece the companies do not want ordinary people to understand, so listen closely. Every state has a Department of Insurance run by a commissioner, and that office regulates the companies and enforces the law that says an insurer has to handle your claim in good faith and cannot deny or delay it unreasonably. When an insurer breaks that duty, it is not just wrong. It is a regulatory violation you can report, and a company with a license to protect pays attention to a complaint from the office that can threaten that license in a way it will never pay attention to you screaming on the phone. So we made ourselves impossible to ignore. On Sandra's advice, from that point forward, I stopped talking to the company by phone entirely and put everything in writing. Every question, every request, every dodge, in writing, dated, saved. I asked them, in writing, to identify the specific business activity they claimed voided the policy, and to produce the evidence of it. I asked them, in writing, to explain how 11 years of accepted premiums squared with a policy they now claimed had been void from a misrepresentation. Every time they stalled or gave a non-answer, I saved that too, because a paper trail of stalling is itself the evidence of bad faith. I was not building an argument anymore. I was building an exhibit. Then I pulled the 11 years. This was the part that felt, honestly, like justice all by itself, sitting at the little rental table night after night. I pulled every single premium payment we had ever made, 11 years of bank records, and I laid them out in a spreadsheet. Every draft, every dollar, on time, month after month after month. I printed the policy in full. I gathered the fire department's report, which stated plainly that the fire originated in old electrical wiring behind the range, not in any oven and not in any baking, which quietly demolished any implied connection between Teresa's cinnamon rolls and the fire. And I assembled the whole thing, the payment history, the policy, the fire report, the contents inventory, Sandra's estimate, and my written record of every stall into one organized complaint. Sandra walked me through what a good complaint looks like, because a regulator, like anyone, pays more attention to a clear, organized, provable grievance than to an angry ramble. We kept it cold and factual. We laid out the timeline plainly, the on-time premiums, the covered fire, the friendly early days, the slow ghosting, the denial and its stated reason, and the fire report that quietly severed any link between that reason and the actual cause of the loss. We attached everything, labeled and dated. We did not editorialize. We did not need to. When you set the facts of a bad faith denial down in a row, they make the argument for you, and a regulator reads them in exactly that spirit. We filed it with the state insurance commissioner, a formal, documented complaint alleging bad faith denial and unreasonable delay, with exhibits, laying out 11 years of premiums, a legitimate covered loss, and a denial built on a woman's weekend baking. And here is where the temperature of the whole thing reversed, fast, the way it does when the person who thought they held all the cards realizes the table has turned. Because a regulator does not read a complaint like that and shrug. A regulator forwards it to the company with a formal notice and a deadline, and requires a written response. And suddenly, the same company that had ghosted us for weeks was under a legal obligation to explain itself, in writing, to the one office that could actually hurt it. The adjuster who had stopped returning my calls suddenly found his phone. That is not a figure of speech. Within days of the commissioner's office contacting the company, I got a call from a new person, a claims manager this time, several rungs up the ladder from Doug, whose voice had that careful, over-friendly quality of someone who has just been handed a problem by his boss. He wanted to talk. He wanted to understand our concerns. He was sure this could all be worked out. I told him, politely, that Sandra and I preferred to continue in writing, and I could practically hear him understand what that meant, which was that we knew exactly what we were doing, and were not going to say anything on a recorded line that would help him. What followed was not a dramatic confrontation. It was better than that. It was a slow, quiet collapse of their position, under the weight of documents they could not argue with. Faced with the fire report that placed the cause in the wiring, the 11-year payment history, the flimsiness of the bakery claim laid out in a regulator's file, and Sandra's precise accounting of what they owed, the company did the thing companies do when the math finally turns against them. They folded the bet. The denial was reversed. Not appealed, not negotiated down to pennies. Reversed. The claim they had said was worth nothing, the claim built on cinnamon rolls, was suddenly a valid claim they were eager to resolve. And they did not just pay what they had originally owed, because by then it was not just the fire on the table, it was the delay. And the delay had a price. They paid the full claim, the structure, and the contents, the real number Sandra had documented, to rebuild the house and replace what was lost. They reimbursed every dollar of the additional living expenses they had left us floating on a credit card for months. The motel, the rental, all of it. The exact thing Doug had promised in the first week and then vanished on. And because the delay itself had violated their duty to handle the claim fairly, the resolution included penalties for that delay, the interest, and the added costs of them dragging their feet. So that in the end, their attempt to save money by stalling had cost them more than paying honestly ever would have. I have to tell you about Grace in the middle of all this, because she is the reason I did not quit on one of the low nights. There was an evening, deep in the review limbo, before Sandra, when I was sitting at the rental table with the bank records spread out and my head in my hands, genuinely wondering if it was smarter to just give up and swallow the loss and protect what was left of our savings. Grace came out for a glass of water and saw me, and she is 16 and sarcastic and does not do big emotional speeches, and she just stood there for a second and then said, quietly, "They think we are the kind of people who quit." And then she got her water and went back to bed. That was it. But something about a 16-year-old seeing the fight for exactly what it was straightened my spine. They did think that, and they were about to find out they were wrong. Teresa cried when the settlement came through, but it was a different crying than at the rental table. She kept saying, so it was not my fault. And I told her, over and over, no, it was never your fault. It was never the cakes. It was a company that went looking for a reason not to keep its word, and got caught. I watched the shame lift off my wife over the following weeks, like the smoke had lifted off our roof. And if I am honest, that mattered to me more than the money. They had made a good woman feel like a criminal for feeding her neighbors. Getting to hand that shame back, not with a scene, just with the plain proven fact that she had done nothing wrong, was worth every night I spent at that little table with the bank records. Here is what happened next, because the update is the best part, and this one is sweet. We rebuilt. The insurance money did what insurance money is supposed to do, and by the following autumn, we were back in our house. A new kitchen where the old one had burned. New wiring in the walls, so the thing that started it all could never happen again. We moved back in the week before Thanksgiving, and Teresa cooked that Thanksgiving in her new kitchen, with Grace beside her, and Biscuit asleep in a fresh patch of afternoon sun on the new living room floor. And I stood in the doorway of a house we had almost lost twice, once to fire and once to a company. And I do not mind telling you, I got something in my eye. The rebuild itself was not instant or painless, and I want to be honest about that, because the settlement is not a magic wand. There were months of contractors and dust and decisions, of living in the rental while our house became a construction site, of Teresa and me standing in the gutted shell picking out cabinets we could not really picture. But there is a particular kind of good exhaustion that comes from rebuilding something on your own terms, with money that was rightfully yours. And it is nothing like the sick exhaustion of the review limbo. One is the tiredness of being ground down. The other is the tiredness of building. I would take the second one every day of my life. There is a coda to the coda, and it is my favorite part. Teresa never stopped feeling strange about the baking after all that, the thing they had tried to use against her. And so, once we were settled, she did the thing that turned it all the way around. She took a couple of the small classes the county offered, got a proper home kitchen license, the real permits, and started actually selling her cakes and cinnamon rolls. On the books, legitimate, insured correctly this time, with the right kind of policy for it. The very thing they had weaponized to deny us, my wife turned into a small, real, honest business, on her own terms, with the paperwork that makes it untouchable. Last I heard, she had a waiting list for the holidays. Biscuit lived to sleep in that new patch of sun for 2 more good years, by the way. And I mention it because a lot of you will understand that the dog making it out that night and getting to grow old on a new living room floor in a house we fought to keep is somehow the detail that makes the whole thing feel finished to me. He never knew any of it. He just knew warm sun and his girl and a full bowl, which, when you get right down to it, is most of what any of us are fighting to protect. The pencil marks on the door frame are gone, and I will not pretend that does not still ache. That is the thing about a fire, and about a company that betrays you. You can be made whole in every way that a settlement can measure. The house rebuilt, the money returned, the penalties paid, and there are still a few things that no amount of good faith restored can give back. But we started new marks on the new door frame, Grace first, standing very straight and insisting she had grown. And someday, there will be 11 years of them again. And that is its own kind of rebuilding, the kind no adjuster ever gets to touch. If there is one thing I want you to take from an ordinary maintenance man who got knocked down and got back up, it is this. When an insurance company denies a claim you know is valid, that denial is very often not a final answer. It is a bet that you will give up. You do not have to face them alone. A licensed public adjuster works for you and only gets paid if you do. And your state insurance commissioner exists precisely to hold these companies to the promise they sold you. Put everything in writing. Keep every receipt. Document the delay itself, because the delay is the crime. And do not, ever, let them make you ashamed of who you are. So let me leave you with the question Teresa and I still talk about. Was the company just doing business, playing the odds the way businesses do? Or did they cross a real line the moment they tried to use a woman's church cinnamon rolls to deny a family a home? And did the penalties they paid really cost them enough to make them stop doing this to the next family? Be honest with me. And I would love to know where you are all listening from tonight. So drop your state and your age. And if you have ever fought an insurance company and won, or lost, tell us. Because somebody scrolling by needs to hear that it can be done. If this one meant something to you, a like and a subscribe help more than you would think. And I will see you in the next one.